I'm Randall Burkett. I'm the curator of African American collections in the Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library here at Emory University, and delighted to welcome you to this program this afternoon. It's really through the generosity of Camille Billups and Jim Hatch that we are here this afternoon. As I think all of you in this room are aware, a number of years ago, Camille and Jim decided that they would place their papers that they have gathered over the last 30 or so years, their extraordinary collection of books and manuscripts and photographs and interviews and slides documenting African American art openings all over the country, and prints and all of the material really that they have assembled over all of their lifetime together in New York is coming as a gift to Emory University. And it's an extraordinary act on their part, and has had a profound effect on African American collections at Emory. So at the outset, I want to say to both Camille and Jim, thank you so much for what you have done and are doing on our behalf. Because their collections are especially strong in two areas, in art and art history and theater history, and because they have become something of evangelists for African American collections, you may not have thought of Camille as an evangelical, but she not Pentecostal, but evangelical. She has done, both she and Jim have talked to people about the materials that they've assembled through their own lifetime, either as collectors or as creators of theater, art, music, dance. And so many collections have come to us in the wake of this wonderful gift that they have made and the trust that they have placed in Emory University. And two of the principal areas of our collecting, as you would imagine, are art and art history and African American theater. As you probably are aware, Jim is the leading authority on African American theater, and we've at Boland's papers, Paul Carter Harrison papers, a number of papers of directors and actors and historians of the theater have come. But also wonderful collections related to art and art history. We have the papers of Benny Andrews. We recently acquired an edition of 22 linear feet of books from the library of Cedric Dover, whom some of you will recognize as the author of American Negro Art, the book was published in 1960. Dover's widow is living in England, and I'm forced to go there as often as possible to pick these materials up and to see what may be in the attic that she missed. I don't want her to get everything in just one trip. I mean, it would be unseemly to press her in that way. But a wonderful addition to the Dover collection, including correspondence with virtually all of the artists whose work is represented in that collection. So Bearden and Barthe, and the list goes. It's a wonderful collection of correspondence and these books that he gathered with that are each. His books are memory books that he has laid in a letter from Paul Robeson and a photograph of Robeson and a letter from Du Bois and a photograph of Du Bois in his bathing suit. I didn't know that Du Bois was a swimmer. I don't know if he swam or not, but he wore a bathing suit. But the papers of Gilbert Coker, Whitney LeBlanc, Samela Lewis, James A. Porter. We really have, we have an extraordinary collection already of papers in this area, and we're really delighted this afternoon to acknowledge and publicly thank and recognize Hazel Biggers, Mrs. John Biggers, for deciding that her husband's papers should be here. And we're grateful to Amalia K Amaki, who directed to us the papers of Paul Jones, who was, as I think everyone in this room knows, was an extraordinary collector, patron of the arts, patron of artists, as well as a political figure, a civil rights activist, a businessman. He was having a wide-ranging career. So having these two papers, and I will say we had very much hoped that Dr. Samela Lewis would be able to join us on this panel. Her papers have recently come here as well, and but she's not been well and just felt it was too much to make the trip from Los Angeles. But we want certainly to call her name and wish her well and thank her.
Interesting narrative, the meeting of Paul Jones. I met Paul Jones when I was sent to his home as a volunteer for Apex Museum, which was Collections of Life and Heritage at the time. And I thought he was another Paul Jones. I thought he was a Paul Jones who was an editor at the Atlanta Journal, and who I had interned under while I was a student at Georgia State. So I had a little attitude about going to the home of this Paul Jones and knowing that he had all this African American art. I had an issue with that. So I showed up with an attitude, and when Paul Jones, who was the owner of the art, appeared at the door, I really thought he was a butler. After that embarrassing moment, the next thing I knew, he invited me in, and those of you who know Paul know he's always happy to see a young lady at his door. He invited me in, and while I waited for two colleagues who were supposed to help catalog his collection, the first thing I noticed was he had a Henry Tanner print on the floor. And I said, "Do you know what you have on your floor?" And he said, "Yes, but do you see any wall space for it?" And that was when I realized that every inch of the wall was taken. He had things propped up in bathrooms, he had things in closets, so it dawned on me that, and I won't even get into the discussion we had about photography, but he had very little at that point, but I educated him. And but what struck me immediately in having a serious conversation with him was that he had collected with a mission. And it was more than collecting for the sake of financial improvement down the road. That he had as a part of that mission, a core mission, I call it a peculiar mission. But he had this mission of first, inspiring other people to collect. Secondly, that the art not be hidden. One of the problems he had with it in his home, and he said he bought it to live with it. The art was like his family. But he also said, I can't get enough people through this house. And the art needs to be seen. Why? Because he realized that art is living, breathing stuff. And that art carries the stories of people. People as members of a group, but also people as individuals. He also had a mission of art being a tool that could be used to bring diverse people together, unlikely people, he said. So that mission inspired me. I'm part Native, and I'm not ashamed of it. And one of the things that always impressed me was my mother always quoting her mother, who was full Choctaw, and she said, you know, my mother always said, as a Native, as an Indian, she hated a wasted journey. I saw in that collection an opportunity to have a journey that would not be wasted. And it's a journey that started in 1980 and continues to this day, even though Mr. Jones is no longer with us. And I hope that that mission will be fulfilled in part because of the gift to Emory. This is a good place. I think there is an understanding of what an archive can do in an educational environment. I think, for me personally, how it become very selfish for me. For me personally, I think some of the more valuable materials are the biographical files of artists. There are hundreds of files on artists. And as an art historian, those of us who look at the lives of African American artists know how invaluable that kind of information is. There are too many artists whose work cannot be effectively contextualized because we don't know where they studied, who they were talking to, what they did recreationally, what they loved beyond art. Were they secret poets? Well, Paul gathered that kind of information. If an artist sent him a bill and had a post note on it, he kept the post note. And it looked a little absurd in the beginning, but over time I've come to appreciate what that means. There's even a style of speaking that you can obtain from looking at a series of just handwritten notes on a postcard invitation to a show. So those are the kinds of things, the artist files, the catalogs. He purchased catalogs that often within months were out of print. So there are catalogs of artist exhibitions. There's some correspondence between Mr. Jones and artists. And I think what's interesting about what is here is there's a point where you will begin to see an overlapping of papers that were related to his work in government, overlapping the correspondence and other materials with those artists. For example, I think going through his files one day, I saw when he was director of Model Cities and living in Charlotte, where he had attempted to put together an art program as a part of the Model Cities plan. And one of the artists that responded to him that was receptive to that idea was Elizabeth Catlett. So there's some interesting crossover opportunities, I think, in the work. His research at Yale in the School of Alcohol Studies, crossing over with some work that he did in the parole courts, where he particularly took interest in some parolees who he found therapeutically were making art, and he would acquire some of that art. So that there's artwork that crosses over in those areas as well. So there are papers, books, catalogs, postcards, invitations. There's an interesting album that sort of chronicles Paul's life from as a young boy all the way up through the Nixon years. He had a very interesting relationship with 3 presidents: Johnson, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Not many people can say that in one sentence. And it's very interesting, the kind of social life that he had around those kind of political, what I call his political and governmental years, that don't really separate cleanly from the things related to African American art. African American art collecting for him became a political act. So it cannot be separated from that aspect of his life.